I have buried a good many men in my time, and I will tell you the truth, a livery keeper learns young. A town will close its doors faster than a fist when the cold comes on, and a stranger needs something. I watched it happen. The autumn Junia car walked into Tasker's Crossing with a boy by the hand and nothing in her pockets but her own 2 fists, and I watched 12 doors shut on her before the light failed. And then I watched the hardest man I ever soldiered beside set a third plate at a table that had held 1 chair for 9 years. I am old now, and most of what I knew is under the grass on the bluff. But that winter I remember the way you remember the one warm room in a long house. Let me tell it. She came in on the noon freight, or what was left of it. Orrin Strout ran a sorry outfit of 3 wagons hauling between the railhead at Cobb and the mining camps up in the breaks, and he kept a cook, because men will quit a hard road if the food is bad and stay on a worse one if it is good. The cook was Junia. She fed 11 teamsters on flour and salt pork and whatever the country gave her, and she did it out of a wagon box in weather that would have soured a saint, and she did it with a brother no bigger than a fence post to keep alongside. Tam, his name was. 8 years old that fall, all elbows and eyes, the kind of boy who looks at the world like it owes him an explanation. Their folks were 3 years dead of the fever down in the bottoms, and a girl of 20 does not have many roads when she is left with a child to raise and no people to take them. She took the only road there was. She cooked. Then Strout went broke. It is no great mystery how. He drank his profit and gambled the rest and lost a wagon to a creek in flood, and at Tasker's Crossing he sold the teams and the iron to settle what he owed and rode out before dawn without paying his cook the season's wages she'd earned. He left her a paper that said he was good for $40 and her keep, and a paper from Orrin Strout was worth about what you would expect. That is how she came to be standing on the boardwalk with a carpet bag, a boy, and $40 that did not exist, while the only outfit that had use for her rattled away empty into the high grass. I did not see all the doors close. I saw 2. I had my forge cold and my horses fed, and I was standing in my big doorway the way an old man does, watching the street go gray when she came along asking. She was not begging. I want that understood. She had her chin up and her voice level, and she asked at the mercantile if they wanted a girl who could cook and keep books, and Prout that ran it told her he had a wife for that, which was a lie, because Prout's wife had run off to her sister's in the spring and the whole street knew it. She asked at the hotel. The Crossing had a hotel, 2 stories and a sign, and the woman there told her they were full up, which was another lie, because nobody was traveling that late in the year and the rooms upstairs were as empty as a church on Monday. She asked at the eating house. She asked at the church, where the preacher told her the Lord would provide and did not himself provide so much as a chair. And every one of them, when they looked at her, looked past her at the boy, and you could see the arithmetic going on behind their eyes. A grown woman who can cook is worth something. A grown woman and a hungry child is a debt. They were not cruel people, the folks of Tasker's Crossing. They were only the kind of careful that looks exactly like cruelty when you are the one on the wrong side of the door. She came to me last, or near last. I told her I had no money to hire and no woman's work for her, which was the plain truth. A livery is hay and harness and the smell of horses, no place for a child to bed down with winter coming. But I am ashamed to say I told it to her the way the rest had, with my eyes already sliding off her to my supper. And the boy, while we talked, had gone to the rail where my saddle horse stood, and that horse, a mean-done gelding that had bitten 3 men that I knew of, put his big head down over the rail and let that boy stroke his nose like the 2 of them had an arrangement. I watched it, and I felt something turn over in me, the way it does when you see a thing that is plainly meant, and you are about to ruin it anyway with no. It was the boy who said it. He came back from the rail and he tugged her sleeve and he said low, like he hoped I wouldn't hear, "Junie, the man with the sword takes hands." Strout said, "He pays cash and he don't ask about folks' business." She told him to hush, but I had heard, and I knew exactly who the boy meant, and a cold went down my back that had nothing to do with the season. There was a man up on the tableland, on the green bench above the town where the grass ran deep enough to lose a calf in, who ran a horse and cattle outfit he called the Lance Bar. He bought hands in the fall when the work was heavy, and he paid them in coin, and he turned them off before the snow, and they came down to my livery to thaw out, and they would not say much about him, except that he was square and he was silent, and he was the most frightening man any of them had ever stood near. They did not mean he raised his voice. He never raised his voice. They meant the other thing. They meant that when he passed you a feed bucket you felt, somewhere in the animal part of you, that you were in the presence of a man who could take your life as easy as he took the bucket back, and that he carried this around with him the way other men carry a watch, not using it, just having it, knowing the time. His name was Asa Holt, and I knew him, which none of the others did. I had known him a long time, and I had not spoken to him in 9 years, though we lived an hour apart, because there are some men you have seen at their worst and you cannot sit across a table from afterward, and Asa was that to me, and I believe, was that to him. We had ridden together in the war and after. I will not make a long tale of it. He was in the 9th, the cavalry, and so was I, and in those years there grew up around Asa Holt a name that traveled faster than any of us could ride. The Saber of the 9th, they called him. He was a swordsman the way some men are singers, born to it, made for it, terrible in his gift. I have seen him do things with a cavalry saber on a running horse that I have never seen another living man do, and I have prayed never to see again. The plain truth of it is that he was very good at killing, and it came to him easily, and that is a thing that will hollow a man out from the inside if there is any soul left in him at all, and there was soul left in Asa Holt, more than he wanted. After the surrender there was a stretch of years of the kind of work men like us could get, guarding payrolls, riding for cattle outfits in range troubles, the gun and blade work of a hard country. And at the end of one of those years there was a thing that happened that I was there for, and that I will tell you about when the telling comes, and after it Asa Holt put up his sword. He wrapped it in oiled cloth, and he hung it on the wall of a house he built with his own hands on the green bench, and he did not draw it again, and he turned to horses and cattle in silence, and that is the man my forge warmth wouldn't reach, but the boy's small finger on a mean horse's nose somehow did. "You don't want to go up there," I told her. I meant it kindly and it came out wrong. "That's a hard man, miss, hardest in the high grass. He turns his hands off before the snow. He'd not keep a woman and a child." She looked at me a long moment, and I will tell you what was in her face, because I have thought on it many times since. It was not fear and it was not anger. It was a kind of arithmetic of her own, done quicker and braver than mine. She had asked 12 doors and gotten 12 no's, and the only word she had heard about a 13th door was that the man behind it paid cash and did not ask a body's business, and she had a child who had not eaten since morning and a country that was about to freeze, and a hard man who would not ask her business was, to a woman in her place, not the worst thing in the world. It was nearly the only kind thing she'd heard all day. "Then he can tell me no himself," she said, "and I'll have lost nothing but the walk." It was 4 miles up to the Lance Bar, climbing all the way. I gave her the lantern off my own peg, and I told her to keep to the wagon track and not to cut across the bench in the dark, and I will admit that, after she'd gone, I stood in my doorway a long time with the cold coming down off the tableland, and I thought about saddling the dun and riding after her. And I did not, because I was a coward about Asa Holt and had been for 9 years, and that is the plain truth a man ought to be able to say once before he dies. What happened at the gate of the Lance Bar I did not see. I had it later in pieces, some from her, more from the boy, who told a thing the way it ought to have happened rather than the way it did, and a little from Asa himself in the one long talk we ever had about that winter, years on. But I have set it together so many times in my mind that I can hand it to you whole, and I believe it is near enough true. She came up the last rise as the light went out of the sky altogether, the lantern throwing a yellow ball around her and the boy and nothing beyond. The Lance bar sat back from the track behind a pole gate, a long, low house of squared logs with a dog trot down the middle and a stone chimney at either end, and a barn bigger than the house, and corrals, and the smell of horses and wood smoke and cold. There was one light in the house, low, a single window. She set the boy behind her at the gate and she called the house. Twice. The second time the door opened and a man filled it, big in the firelight behind him, and he did not come out and he did not speak. He stood there. And whatever it is, that frightened grown teamsters came off him across 30 feet of dark, because she told me later that her whole body wanted to take the boy and run, and the only thing that kept her at that gate was that there was nowhere on earth to run to. I heard you take hands, she called. I can cook for a crew of 30 as easy as 3. I can keep a kitchen and a garden and books, and I'll work for keep mine and the boys through the winter, and wages if you can pay them, and you'll not be sorry. He let the silence sit. Then he said, and his voice was low and even and carried like a stone dropped in a well, I turned my hands off before the snow. I heard that too, she said. But you've not turned off this snow yet. It's coming tonight. I can smell it. So have I a roof for tonight, mister, and we'll argue the rest in the morning when neither of us is talking in the dark. I think it was that more than anything. Not the need in her, he'd turned away need before, he was made to turn away need. It was that she'd argued back. She'd stood at the gate of the most frightening man in the high grass with a child behind her knees, and she'd told him the snow was coming and called him on the dark. And a thing that had not moved in Asa Holt in 9 years moved about a quarter of an inch. He came down off the step. He came to the gate. And he looked for the first time past her, the way the whole town had looked past her. But where the town had seen a debt, Asa Holt looked at that boy in the lantern light, that boy who looked back at him not with the fear that grown men had, but with the flat, curious stare of a child who has not yet learned what a man is supposed to be afraid of. And Asa Holt looked at that boy a long time. There's a stove in the bunk room, he said at last. It's empty. You'll find wood under the lean-to. Bank it good, the chimney draws hard. And he turned and went back into the house. And that was the whole of it. No welcome, no warmth. Just an empty bunk room and a chimney that drew hard. And to a woman who'd had 12 doors shut in her face, it was the first open one in 100 miles. And she has told me, she sat down on the bunk that night with the boy asleep against her, and the snow starting to tick on the roof. And she cried for the length of time it takes a fire to take, no longer. And then she stopped. Because crying was a thing she could not afford, and had not been able to afford for 3 years. And she set herself to the morning instead. In the morning she did not wait to be told. That was the start of everything, I have come to think. She got up before the man did, in a strange dark house on a hard bench in the first snow of the year, and she found his kitchen, a cold, neglected place, a man's kitchen, all wrong-handed and dirty, and she had the stove going and coffee made and a pan of biscuits in before Asa Holt came stamping in from the barn at first light expecting nothing, and found his own kitchen full of the smell of bread. He stood in the door. She did not look up from the stove. She said, "There's coffee," in a voice that did not ask anything, and she put a plate in front of his place and a plate at the boy's place and a plate for herself. And that was the third plate at a table that had held one for 9 years. And Asa Holt sat down in front of food he had not made in his own house for the first time since he built it, and he ate it. And he did not say it was good, but he ate all of it, which from a man like that is the same thing as a hymn. I came up the second day with a load of his hay he'd contracted before the snow, and I want to set down what I found, because I had not been to the Lance bar in 9 years, and I did not know what I was driving up into. I found the place changed in a way you could not put your finger on at first. It was the same hard, silent ranch. But there was washing on a line strung in the dog trot, small clothes and large, snapping in the cold sun. And there was a boy in the corral with the mean dun gelding. Asa had bought the dun off me years back. I'd forgotten, and I had not known the brute would let a child near him. But there the boy was on the top rail, talking to that horse a mile a minute, and the horse standing for it, and there was wood smoke coming thick and homey out of the kitchen chimney, instead of the thin, mean thread of a man heating coffee. Asa met me at the barn and helped me throw down the hay and did not say much, which was usual. But when we were done, he stood a moment looking at the line of washing snapping in the dog trot like he was looking at a thing he could not account for. And he said to me, the first words he'd said to me in 9 years that were not about hay. I never said they could stay past the snow. No, I said. Cook stiffed by Strout, he said. I know Strout's outfit, he'd not pay her. He didn't, I said. Asa was quiet. Then he said, she didn't ask charity. She said keep for work. There's work. He said it like a man arguing with somebody who wasn't there, which is to say he was arguing with himself. And I knew Asa Holt well enough once to know that when he was arguing with himself he had already lost. And so I said nothing, and I drove my empty wagon down off the bench feeling, for the first time in 9 years, something other than dread when I thought of the man up there. Now I have to tell about the saber, because the boy found it the first week, and the boy was the reason the whole thing happened, and it would be false to leave it out. It hung on the wall over the cold north chimney in the main room, wrapped in its oiled cloth on 2 wooden pegs, a long shape under the cloth that any boy raised on the frontier would know in a heartbeat for what it was. Tam knew. He was 8 and he was all eyes, and he had heard the teamsters call this man the man with the sword. And here on the wall of the man's own house was a sword, wrapped up like a body, and a boy is not going to leave that alone. Junia had told him to keep his hands off the man's things, and he kept his hands off it mostly, but he could not keep his eyes off it. And one evening, they took their meals at the man's table by then, the 3 of them, in a silence Junia filled with the small business of food because Asa would not fill it, and the boy was too smart too. One evening the boy looked up from his plate at the wrapped shape on the wall, and he asked, in the plain way of a child who does not know the question is loaded, Mr. Holt, is that the sword, the one folks are scared of? I was not there for it. Junia told me. She said the air went out of the room. She said she put her hand on the boy's arm to stop him, and it was too late. The question was out, and she watched Asa Holt go absolutely still over his plate, the way she imagined a man goes still who has been shot and does not yet know how bad. And then Asa Holt set down his fork, and he looked at the boy, not angry, she said. That was the thing that frightened her worse than anger would have. He looked at the boy with a kind of terrible tiredness, and he said, it's a tool, like a froe or a flensing knife. It's a tool for a kind of work I don't do any more. And he got up and went out to the barn and did not come back in until the boy was long asleep, and Junia sat up by the stove until she heard his boots cross the dog trot in the dark, and she did not call out to him, and he did not look in. But she knew he knew she was awake, and she said there was a kind of company in that. The 2 of them awake in the cold dark of that house, neither one saying anything, both of them keeping a watch over the same sleeping boy without ever having agreed to. The snow that should have turned them off came and went and came again, and Asa did not turn them off. There was no day he said they could stay. There was only a long string of days he did not say they had to go, and the not saying built up like the snow, drift on drift, until one morning it had built up so high that the idea of them leaving had quietly become unthinkable without anyone ever having thought it. She earned it. I want that plain. She did not stay on his charity. The woman worked like 3 men. She took that wrong-handed, neglected ranch house, and she set it right room by room, and she took the kitchen garden that had gone to weeds, and she planned it out on paper for the spring, and she kept his books. Asa kept his accounts in his head, which is to say he lost money he never knew he lost, and Junia found it dollar by dollar in the freight bills and the cattle tallies, and she found enough of it the first month to more than pay her own keep, which she pointed out to him in her level voice over supper one night, and Asa, I am told, almost smiled, which on Asa Holt was an event on the order of an eclipse. And the boy worked the horses. This was the other thing, and it was the thing that did for Asa in the end, I believe, more even than the woman. Because Asa Holt loved horses the way some men love God, quietly and without expecting anything back, and he was the best hand with a colt in the high grass, gentle past all his hardness, and here was this boy Tam who had the same gift, raw and untaught, an 8-year-old who could walk up to a green colt and have it following him around the corral inside the hour. Asa watched it the first time over the corral rail with a look on his face I'd have given a good deal to see, and after that he started teaching the boy. Not with words, Asa hadn't the words, but by doing it slow alongside him, his big scarred hands and the boy's small ones both on the same lead rope, and the boy soaking it up like dry ground soaks rain. They would be out at the corral in the cold for hours, the big silent man and the small chattering boy, and the boy talked enough for both of them, and Asa let him, and I have come to believe that those hours at the corral were the first hours in 9 years that Asa Holt was not, somewhere down inside, at war. Junia watched it from the kitchen window. She told me about that too, years later when she could. She said she would stand at the window with her hands in the dishwater and watch the man teach her brother to gentle a colt, and she would feel two things so hard she could scarcely stand up under them. One was a fear, because she knew what the man had been. The teamsters had told her. The saber, the man who could kill you between one breath and the next, and here was that man with his hands a foot from her brother's throat all day long. And the other was the opposite of fear, and she did not have a name for it then, and would not let herself have a name for it for a long while, because a woman in her place could not afford that name any more than she could afford to cry. She had learned that wanting a thing was the surest way to lose it. So she watched, and she said nothing, and she cooked, and she kept the books, and she put a third plate on the table every night, and the winter went on. I should tell you what kind of man Asa was to them, in the small things, because the small things are where a man's truth lives, and the big things are mostly just smoke. He never raised his voice to the boy, not once, in a country where men beat their sons for less than Tam got up to. When the boy let the chickens out and lost half of them to a fox, Asa took him out and showed him how to mend the run and never said a hard word, and the boy worked beside him white-faced all afternoon waiting for the storm, and the storm never came. And that, Junia said, was the day the boy stopped being afraid of him and started loving him, and you could not after that have pried the two of them apart with a bar. Asa whittled. I'd forgotten that about him. In the war he was always whittling, in the bad waiting times before a fight. His hands needed something that wasn't a sword. And that winter he whittled the boy a whole drove of horses out of pine, a dozen of them, each one different, a running horse and a grazing horse and a horse with its head up listening, and he left them on the boy's bunk one at a time without a word. And the boy lined them up on the windowsill in the bunk room and named every one, and would not have traded the lot of them for a real pony. And I have one of those little pine horses on my own mantle to this day. The boy gave it me years on, and I would not part with it for money. And he was careful of her. That is the word, careful. He did not court her. Asa Holt would no more have known how to court a woman than how to fly, but he was careful of her in 100 wordless ways. He saw that the wood was always split and stacked deep before a storm so she'd not have to go out in it. He fixed the kitchen door that hung wrong so it would not pinch her hand, fixed it in the night when she was asleep so she'd not see him do it, and she came down in the morning to a door that swung true and a man at his coffee who would not meet her eye, and she understood. He took to riding the boy down to me at the livery on a Saturday, so the boy could be among folks and other children, and while the boy played in the yard Asa would stand in my big doorway, and after a few of those Saturdays we got to where we could stand there together, the two of us, not saying much, the way we used to before the bad thing, and I felt the 9 years closing up like a wound that has finally been let to heal. It was on one of those Saturdays, with the boy out in the yard and the snow gray on the street, that Asa told me the rest of it, about the sword. I had been there for the end of it, the thing that made him hang it up, but I had never had it from him in words, and he gave it me that day in his low, even voice looking out at the falling snow, and I will set it down short because he set it down short. It was a range war, the last of the gun work he took. He was hired by the wrong side, though he did not know it was the wrong side going in, and by the time he knew, he was in it, and in those things you do not get to walk out part way. There was a night raid that went bad. There was a barn and men in it that the outfit Asa rode for meant to burn out. And in the dark and the fire there was a young one. Asa thought he was a grown man with a gun. And he was a boy of maybe 15 with a shotgun bigger than he was. And Asa was the saber of the ninth, and he did the thing he was made to do, fast before he saw. And when the fire came up, he saw what he had done. He hung up the sword that week. He took the pay he was owed and gave it to the dead boys' people without ever telling them whose hand it was. And he rode north into the high grass and bought the green bench off a man who was glad to sell. And he built a house with his own hands and hung the saber on the wall of it wrapped in oiled cloth. And he made himself a vow that he has kept, that he would never again take up the blade against a living man. Not for pay, not for pride, not for anything. That he was done being the kind of tool he'd been. And he meant to live the rest of his life on that bench among horses and never kill again, even if it cost him his own life, because his own life he reckoned a fair forfeit and another man's he did not. And then a woman shows up at my gate, he said, looking at the snow, with a boy about the size that one was, and I think, well, there's the bill come due. He was quiet. Only it didn't come due like I figured. It came up the road on a cold night and asked me for a roof. He turned the coffee cup in his big hands. I don't know what I'm doing, Lem, he said, which was the most words about himself he had said to a living soul in 9 years. I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't want it to stop. I told him the only true thing I knew, which was that a man who is afraid he doesn't deserve a good thing is usually exactly the man who does, and the men who deserve nothing never wonder about it at all. He grunted at that, but I saw it land. And we stood in the doorway and watched his boy. I caught myself thinking it that day, his boy, and I let the thought stand play in the snow with the other children of Tasker's Crossing. And the snow came down, and I thought, fool that I am, that the worst was behind all of us. It was not. The worst was Orrin Strout, and he came back in March. I have wondered since whether Strout would ever have come back if the camps in the breaks hadn't shut down and left him broke and mean, and looking for any dollar he could squeeze. He'd sold his outfit and his teams the fall before, but a man like Strout does not stay sold up long. He talked his way into a job collecting for a freight combine out of Cobb, the kind of work that suits a man who is good at taking and bad at making, and he'd 2 hard cases riding with him. And somewhere along the line, he'd remembered that he'd left a cook unpaid up in the high grass, and somewhere in the rotten arithmetic of his head, he'd turned it around so that she owed him. There was a thing about an advance he claimed he'd paid her, against her wages, against her keep, money she'd never seen. Strout could prove anything with a paper, because he made the papers. And he came up to Tasker's Crossing in March with 2 men and a grievance, and the news, which he'd had off somebody, that his runaway cook was wintering up at the Lance bar with the boy, doing well for herself. And Orrin Strout did not like to hear of folks doing well that he reckoned he had a claim on. He came to me first, because everyone comes to the livery. He wanted horses fed, and he wanted to know the way up to the Lance bar, and he sat his horse in my yard with his 2 men, and he told me his business in the loud, ugly way of a small man who has found 2 larger men to stand behind. And the gist of it was that the car girl had skipped a debt, and he meant to collect it, in coin, or in goods, or in the girl herself coming back to cook off what she owed, and the boy he'd take or leave as it suited. He said it like that, the boy he'd take or leave, and I felt the old cold come down my back. But it was a different cold than the one I used to feel about Asa, and I understood, standing there in my own yard, that there are 2 kinds of frightening men in this world, and they are not the same kind at all, and that I had spent 9 years afraid of the wrong one. I did not tell Strout the way to the Lance bar. I told him there was no debt the law would honor and he'd best ride back to Cobb. He laughed at me and said he'd find the way himself. The whole town knew it, and he was right. The whole town did, and somebody told him. And that afternoon Orrin Strout and his 2 men rode up the wagon track to the green bench, and I shut my forge and saddled the mean dun and rode after them, because I was done, after 9 years, being a coward about anything at all. I came up the last rise behind them, and what I saw I will carry to my own grave. Strout and his 2 men were sat their horses in the yard of the Lance bar in the gray March light. Junia stood on the step of the house with the boy held behind her, and her face was white and set, and Strout was up on his horse telling her the lie about the debt in his loud voice, so the men with him could hear it and believe it, working himself and them up to the taking. And in the open door of the house, in the dark of the dog trot behind her, stood Asa Holt, and Asa Holt had the saber in his hands. He'd taken it down. 9 years on the wall, and he'd taken it down and unwrapped it, and it lay across his 2 open palms, still in its scabbard, and he stood in the dark of the door with it held out level in front of him like a man holding something that had died. And I knew Asa. I had soldiered with him. I knew that he was standing at the worst crossroad of his life right there in his own doorway. Because the old thing was in him. I could see it from 30 feet. The saber was in his hands and the men were in his yard, and they meant harm to the woman and the boy he had let himself love, and every wire in Asa Holt that had ever been strung for killing was singing tight, and the saber of the 9th could have crossed that yard and ended all 3 of those men before they cleared leather. And a part of him wanted it the way a thirsty man wants water, the old terrible gift rising up in him hungry after 9 years fast, and against it stood the vow. And the dead boy in the burning barn, and the small living boy behind the woman's skirts who was watching him, watching Mr. Holt, to see what kind of man he was. And Junia, God bless her, Junia did the bravest thing I ever saw a soul do. She did not look at Strout. She turned half around on the step, away from the 3 armed men in the yard, and she looked back into the dark of the doorway at Asa Holt with the sword in his hands, and she said, not loud, but I heard it, the whole yard heard it. It was that kind of quiet, she said. Asa, not for us. Don't you take that up for us. We're not worth what it'd cost you. It was the exact wrong thing and the exact right thing. Wrong, because a woman with 3 hard cases in her yard ought to want the most dangerous man in the territory to be at his most dangerous on her account. Right, because she had seen, in the 1 second she'd looked at his face, the whole war going on inside him, and she loved him enough. She knew it then. She told me in that 1 second at the worst possible time. She finally let herself know it. She loved him enough to tell him to stay out of hell on her account even if it cost her everything to say it. We're not worth what it'd cost you. She'd seen the dead boy in the barn in his face without ever having been told the story. Some women can do that. She did it. And it reached him. I watched it reach him. The wires went slack. Not all at once, it cost him. You could see it cost him. The old gift fighting going back in its scabbard, but it went. And Asa Holt did a thing then that took more out of him than any killing ever had. He walked out of the doorway into the light with the saber in his 2 open hands, and he came down off the step past Junia and past the boy, and he walked out into the middle of his own yard among the 3 mounted men, unhurried, the sword still sheathed and held flat across his palms, offered almost, and he stopped in front of Orrin Strout's horse and he looked up at Strout, and he said, in that low, even voice that carried like a stone down a well, "You know who I am." It was not a question. Strout knew. You could see the knowing hit him. Everyone in that yard knew who Asa Holt was, the saber of the 9th, the man the teamsters whispered about, and Strout's 2 hard cases, who were men of the gun and blade trade themselves, knew the name better than anyone, and I watched the color go out of the 2 of them as it landed who they were sitting their horses across from. Asa stood there in the open, unarmed in every way that counted, the sword sheathed, his hands full of it and so empty for any quick work. And he was the most dangerous thing in that yard by 100-fold, and he had made himself, on purpose, look like the least. And there is a kind of power in that a man who has nothing left to prove can stand in front of you holding his terror sheathed across his open hands, and it is more frightening than any drawn blade. Because it tells you that he does not need it, that he is so far past needing it that he can hold it out to you like a thing of no account. "There's no debt here," Asa said, quiet to Strout, to all 3 of them. "You know there's not. You wrote it yourself on your own paper. The girl cooked your season and you ran out on her wages, and I expect she's the one's owed, not you. But I'm not going to argue dollars with you in my yard." He let that sit. Then he said, I put this away 9 years ago. I made myself a promise about it I mean to keep, and the man I'd have to be to break it is a man I'd rather die than be again. So I'm not going to draw it. Not on you, not on anybody, not ever. You hear me? I will not draw it. He paused, and his voice did not rise, but something came into it, and I have never in my life heard anything like it before or since. But these are mine, he said. This house, that woman, that boy, mine to keep, and I will keep them. And if you make me Strout, I will keep them with my bare hands and my bare life, and I will not draw the sword to do it, and you will still wish I had. And he stood there, holding the sheathed saber out flat across his open palms, offering it to the gray sky. And the most frightening man in the high grass had just told 3 armed men that he would let them kill him before he would kill them. And somehow it was the most terrifying thing any of us had ever heard, because we all understood at the same moment that a man who will die before he'll kill you is a man you cannot frighten, cannot move, cannot stop. A man who has gone all the way through fear and out the other side into something there is no name for, and that you might gun him down where he stood, and you would only have killed your own death. You would never have beaten him. He had beaten you the moment he walked into the yard with the sword sheathed. Strout's 2 hard cases looked at each other, and then, without a word being said between them, they turned their horses. They had hired on to lean on a runaway cook, and instead they had ridden up against the saber of the 9th, holding his own death out flat across his hands, and telling them he'd spend it before he'd spend theirs. And there is no money in that. There is no winning in that. And they were men of the trade, and they knew a thing they could not win when they saw it. And they rode out of the yard and down the wagon track, and they did not look back. And Orrin Strout, left alone on his horse with a sheathed sword held out under his stirrup and a man's flat eyes on him and no hard cases at his back, did the arithmetic at last that he should have done in Cobb, and he cursed, and he wheeled his horse, and he went after his men, and that was the end of it. No blood, not a drop. The sword never left its scabbard. I came down off the rise on the mean dun with my old heart going like a hammer, and the yard was empty of everything, but Asa Holt standing in the middle of it with the saber across his hands and his head bowed, and Junia coming down off the step to him slow, and the boy behind her, and the gray light, and the high grass running off green and forever in every direction. She came up to him, and she put her 2 hands over the sword in his hands, over his hands and the sword both. And she did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and they stood like that, the 2 of them holding that sheathed terror between their 4 hands in the middle of the yard, and then she took it from him. Just lifted it out of his hands gentle as you take a sleeping child, and she turned and carried it back into the house and up onto the 2 pegs over the cold north chimney, and she wrapped it back in its old cloth, and she hung it there, and it has hung there ever since, and Asa Holt never took it down again as long as he lived. I know, because I was up at that house 1,000 times over the years that followed, and it hung there over the cold chimney wrapped in its cloth, a tool for a kind of work he didn't do any more, and the only one who ever touched it again was the boy, grown to a man, who took it down the day they buried Asa, and laid it in the grave with him, scabbard and all, unwrapped one last time so the old man could go into the ground with the thing he'd mastered, and then mastered himself against. And there was not a man at that graveside who did not understand that the sword had killed fewer men in Asa Holt's hands than it had saved in the 9 years he refused to draw it. But I am ahead of myself. That was a long way off. That March day in the yard there was no funeral. There was only a beginning, and I will end the telling there, where it ought to end, in the warm and not the cold. They were married that spring. There was no great ceremony. The same preacher who told Junia the Lord would provide and provided nothing himself came up to the Lance bar with the look of a man hopping nobody would remember, and married them in the dog trot with the door fixed, so it swung true and the washing taken down off the line for the day, and the little pine horses lined up on the windowsill. And I stood up for Asa, which closed the last inch of the 9 years between us, and the boy stood up for Junia. And afterward she fed every soul in Tasker's Crossing who'd ride up for it, which was most of them. the same folks who'd shut 12 doors on her in the fall, and she fed them without a hard word, because she was a better soul than the rest of us and held no grudge. And Esau watched her do it from the edge of his own yard with a look on his face that I had last seen on the face of a man who has come up out of deep water and got his first whole breath. I asked him late that day, when the folks were gone and the boy was asleep, and the two of us stood at the corral the way we used to stand in my doorway. I asked him how it was, after 9 years, to be a man with something to lose again. Because that is the fear, the real one, not dying. Any soldier learns to set dying down. The fear is loving a thing in a hard country that can take it from you. The fear of having a gate that the cold and the strouts of the world can come up the road to. And Esau Holt was quiet a long while, the way he was, and the green grass ran off into the dark, and the boys' pine horses glowed in the window behind us, and he said finally, "I spent 9 years up here keeping that sword on the wall so I'd never have anything worth taking it down for." He looked at the lit window, the woman moving behind it, the sleeping boy. Turns out a man can't live that way. Turns out the keeping nothing was its own kind of killing, just slower and only me. He turned the truth of it over the way he turned a coffee cup. "I'd rather have something to lose, Lem," he said, "and the fear of losing it than go back to having nothing and being safe. The fear's the price of the thing, I'll pay it." And then he said, and it was the closest I ever heard him come to speaking of his heart straight out, "She didn't want me to take the sword up for them, said they weren't worth what it'd cost." He shook his head slow. "She had it backwards. They're the only thing I ever found that was worth not taking it up for. That's a different thing. That's the whole thing." I rode down off the bench in the dark with that in my pockets, and I have carried it 40 years, and I am setting it down now because I am old and somebody ought to know it. There was a man in the high grass that the whole territory was afraid of, the most dangerous man any of us ever stood near, the Saber of the Ninth, and a penniless cook walked up to his gate in the first snow with a hungry boy by the hand because every other door in the world had shut on her, and she was not rescued by him. Get that part right. It is the part that matters. She was not rescued. She walked up to that gate on her own 2 feet and argued her way through it and earned her keep 10 times over and put a third plate on a lonely man's table until the table was a home, and what she rescued was him. She rescued the hardest man in the high grass from the long, slow killing of having nothing to lose. And when the worst came up the road and he stood in his doorway with the old terror in his hands, she loved him enough to tell him to keep it sheathed, and he loved them enough to walk out unarmed and hold his own death across his open palms, rather than be the man he'd sworn off being, and they all 3 lived, and built a home on the green bench, and the sword stayed on the wall. That is the whole of it. A town shuts its doors faster than its fists, but there is always, somewhere up a hard road in the dark, one more door, and behind it sometimes the last man on earth you'd expect, setting out a third plate. I have seen it. I drove the hay. I stood up at the wedding. I have a little pine horse on my mantle to prove it. And when they ask me, the young ones, whether the Saber of the Ninth was as terrible as the stories say, I tell them yes. More. And then I tell them the only fight of his I ever saw him win for certain, the only one that was never in any doubt, the one he won in his own doorway with the sword sheathed across his open hands and a woman's voice at his back telling him to lay it down. And I tell them that was the bravest thing, and the most dangerous, that I ever watched a man do, and that he did it for a cook and a boy who'd been turned away at every door in town, and that he'd tell you himself if he were here. That they were worth far more to him, sheathed, than any man he ever met was worth drawn. He's under the grass on the bluff now with the sword. She's beside him. The boy runs the Lance bar, a grown man with sons of his own, and the little pine horses sit on his windowsill yet, and the kitchen door still swings true. And me, I am only the old man who keeps the livery and remembers, and that is enough work for what's left of one life. The cold still comes down off the tableland every fall the way it always did. But I have never once, since that winter, watched a stranger get turned from my door, and I never will as long as there is a stove and a roof and a plate to spare. I learned that from a cook and a swordsman up on the green bench a long time ago, and it is the best thing I know.